All right, Pete. 2 Timothy 3:16.
Oh, yeah.
All scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, well, first of all, that is a passage that shows a lot of respect for Scripture. And it means what Christians call the Old Testament. There's no New Testament at this point. And some have said, by implication, it means the New Testament. No, it doesn't. This is about the Hebrew Scriptures. That's all that this is about. But that's fine, right? But what is it saying? Like, what are the implications of it? And very commonly, at least in some Christian circles, this is sort of a proof text for why the Bible's inerrant, because it's God-breathed, right? So it's inerrant for matters of history or science or anything moral, everything you just sort of, this is the text you go to, this is the top text to prove a particular way of reading the Bible. And I think that's problematic. I think that's actually overreading this passage. It is a really very important passage. But for one thing, all scripture is God-breathed. The word is not in Greek. Greek works that way. Sometimes you leave the verb to be out and it still works out. But to say all scripture is God-breathed, that's not definitely what the text says. We're not making things up here, but just as easily grammatically, it could say every God-breathed scripture, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a little different, right? So it's not making this declarative, all scripture is God-breathed. There's your inerrancy. But it's not saying that. It says all God-breathed scripture is useful. It's profitable, as some translations say. Well, for what? For teaching, right? For correction, for training in righteousness and reproof and things like that, and to equip people for every good work. Okay, now hold on here a second. This is what we're reading here. Another way of putting it: this is not a proof text for inerrancy. This is a proof text for wisdom. Scripture, studying Scripture gives you wisdom. Well, what parts of it? You study all of it.
Yeah.
It's not a license for proof texting, all scripture. Well, here's a verse. Yeah, but verses don't stand alone. Verses have context. So it's not all on like the verse level. I think, this can be debated, but I think all is more the flow of it all. And when you let the different parts sort of talk to each other, even debate each other. See, because the Bible that we have is not a Bible where every author is on the same page. You have diverse points of view. Even, Paul and James didn't get along. That's pretty documented. They had differences of opinion. Chronicles doesn't agree with Samuel Kings. You have different laws in the Old Testament that are, they're the same law, but they do contradict each other in places. So whatever it means that all scripture or all God-breathed scripture or every God-breathed scripture is profitable or useful, I think you have to take into account the character of Scripture itself. You can't just whittle it down to a proof text verse or two that sort of makes your point. You have to, in other words, the Bible is a wisdom book, not sort of an instructional manual. Go to the index, find the verse, and there's your answer. That's not a high view of the Bible. That's actually, I think, a very low view of the Bible, because it sort of absolves us of the responsibility to take it seriously enough to just sit with it in community and not lift verses out of it that are just oftentimes out of context or something like that.
So for you, would you say then that while this passage wasn't talking about the entirety of the Bible, because at that point, once again, the New Testament wasn't collected or canonized, it was talking about the Old Testament, but it could be talking about the whole Bible. Not that that was the intent of the author, but you could affirm that all of the Bible is useful and profitable.
Right, including the New Testament.
New Testament.
Yeah, right, so we have characters of the Gospels where they differ on things, and
right.
Everyone knows that. And Paul's not the most consistent person who ever wrote. In different letters, he says different things, and it depends on the context. We're reading somebody else's mail, and there are situations we don't understand. And then you have, Revelation, which is whatever that is going on, whatever's going on there. So it's showing the respect for the complexity of Scripture, and that it's worthy of our adult attention, not sort of like just picking passages here or there. And that includes the New Testament, sure. It's to drive us towards wisdom and, I think, communion with God through wisdom. it's not a proof text that says you can never like look at a Bible passage and say, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah.
This doesn't sound right to me. I mean, there's, where Christians can take a page out of Judaism, for example, where debating God, read the book of Job, right? Debating God and debating Scripture is part of the tradition. That's actually a form of worship in Judaism, but in Christianity, you're not allowed to do that because of this one passage. It's like, I mean, a Jew wrote that. They understood the multivalence of Scripture and the importance of really taking it seriously enough to hear all those voices. And sometimes there are things you're not sure about. That's not faithlessness. That is actually struggling with the scriptural tradition. This passage doesn't undo all that. It's actually supporting that. Because it's God-breathed, it's profitable for these things that are listed. Well, how is it profitable exactly? Well, now you got us talking, because then you have to flesh out the details, right? And that's part of the journey of just being, I think, a Bible reader and I think, frankly, a Christian.
Yeah, that's so good. So talk to me more about God-breathed. What is that?
I mean, it's a word that it doesn't show up anywhere else. And that isn't the most important thing to say, but it's like, it's not automatically sure what that means. But I think what the author is saying is that Scripture is God influenced. Does it mean that God breathes like into the brains of biblical writers to make them write exactly these words? I don't think so. If you want to think that, that's fine. But then we have to come to terms with the fact that the kind of Scripture that God breathed is diverse, in places contradictory. We have different points of view, all of which is leading us toward discussion and dialogue and debate towards wisdom and communion with God. So that one word, you cannot build what Christians call a doctrine of Scripture. You can't build it on that one word. It's descriptive, I think, of what Jews in general would have thought, that this is our sacred text. It's from God in some sense, but God didn't sit down and write it, and God didn't whisper in Matthew's ear or Paul's ear saying, write exactly this. We're seeing both. I mean, how like inspiration and revelation works, nobody knows, but there's something divine and human going on in the Bible, sort of like Jesus. There's divine and human going on, right? So I mean, to overread that word, God-breathed, which is one word in Greek, is very tempting. Don't give in to the temptation. Just appreciate it. Yeah. But don't try to build a whole theology of the Bible off of that one word.
Right, because a lot of people are inheriting a belief around God-breathed. That means that it's perfect. Right. And that everything that God just, like Greg Boyd says, is lobotomized people, where he took out the brains of authors and then put in the Bible, and then out came this perfect Bible. Right. But that's just not in reality what we have. But what we have, to your point, is actually more incarnational. Right. With like this Jesus, humanity, and divinity. So talk more about why that could actually be like great news and beautiful.
Well, I mean, the Christian faith is interesting because of the degree to which God is part of creation, right? Not just Christianity, Judaism as well, but we have the Jesus part too, where it's sort of like in a special infused way. We have this, a picture of God with us and what that can look like in very concrete terms for us. So that is good news. That is what makes Christianity more than a philosophy, even though philosophy is important. It makes it more than a theological system, although theological systems are important. It makes it more than the Bible. It makes it God is present with us. And the Bible paints pictures of that presence in its own contextually meaningful ways. Whether it's Genesis 1 in 6 days, or whether it's the walls of Jericho falling down, or whether it's, a book like Job, or whether it's the Gospels or Paul's letters. They paint a picture of what it means for God to be with us. And that is, to me, really nice to hear, because it's not a book that was dropped out of heaven. It's a book that honors humanity. It honors the human process. And that's a really piece of good news for me, that the God of creation, what's the word?
Dignifies,
works with. But I don't even like that, because that means God's out there and we're down here. But what if the whole thing is like this? It's just there, and God doesn't make cameo appearances, but God is constantly in and with humanity. So, in other words, when I see things like parts of the Bible that don't fit together very well, well, God can't do that. Well, if God is co-working, the words fail us, these are mysteries anyway, but if God is like infused and in those people, but respecting their humanity, you're going to have that. So in other words, the fact that Chronicles contradicts Samuel and Kings in many, many ways, that doesn't mean, well, which one's God breathed?
Yeah.
They both are. They contradict. They can't. Well, they do.
Yeah.
So what does God breathed mean with a Bible that looks like that, right? So it doesn't, in other words, that quick God breathed thing and appealing to that for like some form of inerrancy, you can't sidestep what people call the problem of Scripture. I use a lowercase p. It's like, you do struggle through the Bible, right? What if that whole thing is what God breathed means, which means valuing and dignifying the humanity, right? Yeah. To me, that is a very, like, finally, okay. Like, I can just breathe. I don't have to get it all right. I don't have to make it all fit. It's not a big jigsaw puzzle. The Bible's not a test from God to make sure you can get everything to fit right, even though it doesn't, right?
Yeah.
It tells us we don't have to ignore science. We don't have to ignore psychology. We don't have to ignore developments in human thought. We don't have to deny quantum physics or any of these kinds of things. We get to be people in our time and place where God is with us.
Yeah.
And we partner with our tradition, which includes Scripture, to talk about what's God like and what's God like here, right? And that whole process, I think, is actually infused by the presence of God, I think, in all reality, right? Now, we've gotten a little bit past our passage, but it's connected, right?
It is all connected.
How you read that depends sometimes on how you see the whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
And it can shape your view of how you understand God to participate with humankind.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So last question about this, because I hear it from my upbringing coming in. Then where would the authority piece come in? So if humans and God partnered to create this sacred text for us, does it lose its authority because it was not downloaded perfectly from heaven?
Okay, well, let's say, yes, it does lose its authority, so we can't do that. Let's go back to the old way of thinking. You still have to struggle with the fact that this authoritative text is messy and diverse and actually doesn't really tell you what to do very well. I mean, you think it does, but it doesn't. Even things like love God, love yourself, love neighbor. Got it. A little help. How do I do that? What does it mean to love God here, right? There's always a wisdom dimension of trying to figure this stuff out, right? So I don't think what about the authority? Maybe we have to reconceive what authority even means, right? Maybe it's not authority here and here. Maybe it's listening to the presence of God in and through us in community, but never authority like God's telling you what to do now. Maybe God isn't telling you what to do, but maybe the way we enact authority is by seeking the divine voice in each other, right? In the Bible, right? In each other, in the history of thought. Christians have thought a lot about this kind of stuff, right? Maybe the authority is, I'm not sure what to do, but I'm not going to make a step without working through that process. And I think that is an authority, right?
Yeah. So the authority is what you're saying, or what I hear you saying, is the authority is actually coming from discerning in the context of community what this message is saying for your...
And where God is present in that process, rather than God is outside of the process looking down, right? To me, that's very important. You have to have sort of a belief in the Spirit of God being basically everywhere, which I think is, to me, that's Christianity 101. That's a very, very important thing. Rather than God is up there and out there, sort of aloof. And, well, I'll see you later. In the meantime, here's the Bible. Listen to everything it tells you to do. And that's actually not historically a Christian way of thinking about the Bible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's simply not. It's actually a very modern, it's a reaction to the idea that the Bible is being attacked, whether through science or Darwin, or German higher criticism of the 19th century or geology. It's being attacked, and so you sort of circle the wagons. This is a new problem. This is not an old problem.
I love that. That's so helpful. Well, thanks for sharing about that. I hope it helps people as they're asking questions about the Bible.
So do I.
Yeah.